After finishing 4th last season, Newcastle find themselves languishing in mid-table behind the likes of Brighton, West Ham and Wolves, although the underlying numbers do suggest they've been a bit unlucky. Here to address whether their bid to become a major force in the Premier League is still on track is JJ Bull, Jon Mackenzie and Jacob Whitehead. Now, to help give this episode a little more focus, we're going to look at how Newcastle are conducting themselves on two fronts: squad building and tactical evolution. We're then going to map out what they're doing onto the plan of two previous Premier League winners to see what point the Toon are at. But first, Jacob, welcome. You covered Newcastle for the second half of last season. Did fans think that ascendancy would continue, or did they expect a bit of regression this campaign? Can you give us an insight into Newcastle fans' psyche?
Think about where Newcastle fans had been. They had really been in the well under Mike Ashley, not just investment, but also playing style. So suddenly when you're given something good, something to hold on to, imagine then turning around and being like, right, I think we're actually going to slip back a bit. There was an element of understanding. I think that there's an understanding that 4th place was not aberration, but an overperformance, and that could have slipped back slightly this season. But there's so much other stuff to be excited about. There was big money signings from Italy. There was a Champions League campaign. Even if they were, say, going to finish 5th or 6th in the league, I think there was hope that there were going to be other things to cling on to. Whether that has happened or not, I'm sure we're going to dive into.
I'm interested as to how the fans view that decline, because we can sit here as pundits and talk about it all day long, but I'm always interested to hear why fans think that suddenly these kind of declines happen.
It's become quite weaponised and polarised, as pretty much anything involving Premier League football does nowadays, especially with Newcastle and the situation around their ownership. I'd say loosely there are two camps. There's one saying, look, this has been a regression. Last season, we were proud about this intensity which we had. Like, there's certain games where Big Six teams came to St James's Park and were absolutely harried away from stuff. And this season, it's not quite happened. If they've been 5% off their levels, but at the margins Newcastle are playing at, with that style, just 5% off can leave these absolutely huge holes, which can look really, really bizarre. There's one early season game against Brighton Hove Albion at the Amex where they're absolutely ripped apart, and people are thinking, well, this is not the Eddie Howe side which we've come to know. And that has continued throughout large parts of the season. But, and this is a really big but of mitigation, injuries. Of course, lots of teams have all had them, but Newcastle don't have the squad depth of lots of other teams who might have had to deal with them. And injuries don't just affect the personnel, but they also impact kind of the evolution of a team's playing style. Newcastle have effectively been locked into a way of playing, which they haven't been able to change under Howe when he'd have liked to this season, starting with same midfield three, who are progressively getting more and more exhausted, which leads towards that lack of intensity. The reality, like anything, it's probably a bit in the middle. Howe probably could have introduced other ways to play earlier, but there are a lot of mitigating factors at play.
Feels like it's been a season of extremes. There's been some real high highs. The win over PSG beat both Manchester clubs in the Carabao Cup, didn't they? But then there's been moments where House had an entire 11 out. Like you said, a lot of mitigating circumstances. I wanted to talk to you while you're here about some of the off-the-pitch stuff too that might hinder their progress moving forward, as well as their sort of medium-term outlook. So can you take us for a whistle-stop tour of PSR and things of that nature?
So PSR is effectively a rule which is meant to govern club spending so that they remain sustainable and you don't get situations where kind of these great cultural institutions are going bankrupt. From a Newcastle perspective...
Is that why? Is that really why?
Well...
I'm through the looking glass.
Now, if we get sort of deep into realms of conspiracy theories, let me explain a very convincing one here.
Yeah.
In the one hand, it is meant to stop clubs going bust, but there's a reason why the league's top 6 teams were so keen to suddenly introduce it, because it does effectively put a cap on spending. The rule is that over a rolling 3-year period, clubs are not allowed to make losses of more than 105 million. There's all sorts of weird kind of stipulations which can make that number go up or down, but that's the essential basis of it. Now, Newcastle have done a lot of that spending right up to the cap. They didn't have many saleable assets in their squad at all. The only sale they've made of any note has been Alan Saint-Maximin, and they have brought in a stack of players over the last 2 or 3 transfer windows, which means that now they're at a bit of a plateau. They've done all of this different stuff to try and grow their revenue. There's been hosting Saudi Arabia friendlies at St James's Park. There's going on tours to the other side of the world. There's signing a new kit deal with Adidas. There's quite a lot of associated moral issues with several of those. This is the reality which they're dealing with as a club, and that is something which can be critiqued. It's probably not the place to dive into it too deeply here. But it means that as they're trying to build their squad, they are effectively going to start running into a brick wall where they need to make sales if they're going to continue to evolve. That's where the big decision is going to happen this summer as they look to both evolve their playing style and evolve their squad.
And they're going to have to do it without the deft touch of Dan Ashworth, who's obviously on his way to Manchester United. Now, like I said at the start of the show, Newcastle have been a bit unfortunate, according to some expected points models. But just how unfortunate? Here's Ruben Pinder as he takes to the streets to ask if anyone can guess.
I'm outside Wembley asking fans if they can guess which team should be in the top half of the Premier League table according to expected points. Let's see what they have to say.
Newcastle move up.
Newcastle go up.
Newcastle down.
Newcastle down, even further down than they are at the moment.
They're playing bad, man.
Liverpool, top. I think Liverpool are going to be top. And if you look lower down the table, West Ham will be sitting a bit lower, like 9th.
At the moment, Villa are seeding themselves this year.
Newcastle.
Yeah, Newcastle at least 5th.
And Villa, lower.
Villa lower, okay. Any other movement?
Manchester United lower.
Manchester City move up. Liverpool move down. West Ham go up.
West Ham go up.
Yeah.
What about those ones down the bottom? West Ham, Brighton, Wolves, Newcastle. Any movement there?
Newcastle underperforming this year, without doubt.
I'd say Newcastle should be doing better.
Newcastle should be doing better.
Yeah.
I'd say Tottenham higher expected points.
Man United and West Ham might do better. They might go up. And Newcastle might go up. I'd probably say Newcastle go up. They probably swap with Wolves.
Manchester City should be, I'd say 2nd rather than 3rd. And also, I think Brighton, should be about 6th. I think 6th, yeah. And also Manchester United, I'd say where 4th is.
Man United would be higher.
I would say Man United should be lower. I think it's going to be weird. I think Wolves are going to be higher.
I thought Wolves would be lower.
I think Villa go down.
Surely we would be in there, top half Chelsea, because we missed so many chances.
Newcastle higher expected points.
I think Newcastle have to be higher.
No.
You don't think so?
I just don't know. I never know with Newcastle. Just Eddie Howe's just changed so much as a coach over the last 5 years.
Yeah, maybe Newcastle higher, to be fair. They are probably better than that.
Newcastle will definitely come up. 100%. I think they're better than Wolverhampton and Brighton this season.
I feel like Newcastle should be about 6th or 7th maybe.
So you've all got something right, and but you've also got something very wrong.
Oh.
So
Was it United?
Newcastle are 5th according to expected
Wow,
points.
okay.
So you were right there.
Okay. Yes.
Chelsea are 6th.
Wow.
Manchester United are not in the top 10.
Okay, so the model that Ruben and his hat used there was obviously understat, which puts Newcastle as high as 5th. Would you say their efforts this season are representative of that heady height?
Yeah, well, of course, other models are available, and other models will give different heights on the table. But basically what an expected points model is doing is taking the XG for and against in games and working out the likelihood of what points you would get from those underlying numbers. Interestingly, if you look at, for example, the Opta expected goals tables, Newcastle are very much mid-table on that metric. So again,
51 goals for, 49 against. Basically.
Sure,
Yeah.
they may have been unlucky in individual games, which is why they would get bumped up the expected points table, but they're still performing around mid-table in terms of some of the underlying numbers as well. So I think it's a bit of a pinch of salt on this one. They've definitely gotten worse, even if they have got a little bit unlucky this season.
Well, expect a John Short on Newcastle's game state imminently. JJ, let's talk transfers, because we want to hold Manchester City up here as an example of how to build a squad, turn a middling team into a title-winning team after X amount of campaigns. And if we were to compare what Newcastle are doing now with what City did back then, what point would the Toon be at?
Well, Man City are the best example to try and, I guess, compare them to because they had a similar situation. Lots of money came in and they had to build a club that was mid-table and turn them into champions. And now, if you look at where Man City were when they were bought, they were mid-table. I think they finished 9th when Sven-Goran Eriksson was the manager, if you recall that. And then Mark Hughes came in and that's where they were, right? So after that, they managed to win the Premier League within 4 years. And they did it we can pretty much divide the Man City's club development into 3 distinct categories. One is floor raising the floor. Another is ceiling raising the ceiling. Another is adding more floors to the house to make it taller and shinier, like a flat, like you have
Much
to live
like
in.
they
that.
want to add a new stand to St James's Park.
Well, that's exactly it. Or more like no one can afford a house. You have to all live in small boxes and apartments. We're all part of the rat race now. Fantastic. Now, Man City have all the money, but they had a mid-table team, as we said. Now, what they've done is they didn't just splash all the money and go kind of nuts with it. They were quite sensible. When they initially came in, it changed football, maybe culture forever, in that Sky Sports transfer deadline day became a thing because all of a sudden they came in trying to buy Berbatov. They ended up signing a big marquee signing in Robinho at the time, and then they signed Joe as well. So a lot of money went in straight away. But the real first transfer window was in January when they signed some sensible transfers. And those sensible transfers were people like Nigel de Jong, who was very important in the title-winning game, remember? He came on as a substitute later on when Balotelli passed to Aguero. Another big signing.
Very sensible indeed.
Yeah. Craig Bellamy, Wayne Bridge, Shea Given. Now, Joe Hart was the keeper at the time, but these are players who are Premier League ready. They raise the floor. So you want to try and raise the level of your team at the floor level so that the whole team is better. So that way your average rating in FIFA goes up. Not by adding better ones at the top, but by getting rid of all the rubbish ones at the bottom. So that's the idea. You raise the floor, build the foundations, and you build towards what the team is going to be. And you want to assemble a core of players who get on with each other, foster a team spirit of sort, and a kind of team that the fans can bond with, and therefore you can build upon that.
That's step one.
That's step one. Now, from comparison, Newcastle were low-spending mid-table relegation, like Jacob was saying, when PAF, is that what you call them? PIF?
Yeah, PIF.
PIF the Magic Dragon. And they bought them in October, but had to wait until January to do the same thing when they spent all the money. Now, they went for a big signing in Guimaraes, but still quite sensible. He's one of the best midfielders in the world, probably, who was be available, because he was at Lyon at the time, and would you just be able to get him. So they got him for a bit of money, and that helped them build a midfield, which is the weakest part of the team, I would say, at the time. Then Kieran Trippier, incredibly sensible signing. I'd compare that to Man City signing Gareth Barry in their second season, the second window, or third window, really, in that he's not multi-positional, but he can play a couple of positions. He's a leader. He's the leader of the gang that you want in that team. You can build around him. He becomes a captain, and he is just the exact standard of player you want, international level, Champions League level player. So you're already raising the floor and starting to make them a bit better.
Bloody loves a yellow card as well.
He loves a yellow card?
Gareth Barry.
That's good.
Loves it. Laps them up.
Well, that's nice.
I've interrupted.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't mind that. It gives me time to look at what I'm about to talk about next.
Yeah, I thought that. I was trying to buy you a little bit of time.
Well, that's good. Now, the manager at the time was Mark Hughes. Now, Mark Hughes was fired, and in comes Roberto Mancini, who is the Eddie Howe, I would say, of this project, because Newcastle sacked or let go of Steve Bruce, and in came Eddie Howe. Now, this is what they did. So over the next few years, what Man City did very well was sign 3 or 4 key players per window, so no more than that, and really no more than 4 key players over a whole season. Because if you buy them all at once and put them in, you destabilise the core of the team. That's what happened to Chelsea. And that's what they tried to avoid. But over the 3 windows that Newcastle have bought in, well, compared to Man City, basically had Company, who's signed by Hughes, actually, but Lescott, Yaya Toure, David Silva, Gareth Barry, James Milner, Carlos Tevez, who were the core of the team that ended up winning that Premier League title. Newcastle brought in Trippier, Botman, Guimaraes, Tonali, Isak, Gordon, Pope. Barnes, would he count as a core? You think so?
There's time still.
I mean, he's so versatile. He can play either side. Seen as good, hard-working, good honest
Good
folk.
squad depth, right?
Yeah.
So that you're raising the floor with Harvey Barnes. He's not going to take you to the next level, but he brings you up and makes your whole squad better. So at this point, Man City, having won the Premier League, they're now in the ceiling-raising section of my TED Talk. And the ceiling-raising bit is probably where Newcastle are at the moment. So they signed Sandro Tonali because they reached the Champions League way ahead of schedule, and this is the problem they've got. So if you are in the Champions League, do you either accelerate your spending and go for players above where you are and possibly disrupt the harmony that you've built, or do you want to continue on a strategic pathway? And Tonali was a ceiling-raising player, do you think, or was it always going to be built this way in strategy?
The intent was that he would be the ceiling-raising player.
Yeah.
The word people were using a lot was unlock when they signed him, not necessarily because of Tonali himself, but what he'd allow the players around him to do. There's theory that having him would allow Bruno Guimaraes to be freed up. So rather than always having him at the base, he'd be able to be a bit more creative and almost have Tonali back there to hold the fort. But then the rest of them were all... The rest of the signings that window were more squad players or long-term players.
Yeah, Livramento, Lewis Hall, like really good young players, because this is the other thing. Newcastle are competing in a different world entirely to what Man City were. So FFP, was it not really the same thing, or was it? I don't really know. They just spent loads of money, right, at the time, but you got a lot more for your money then. Newcastle are looking at spending 35 million on Lewis Hall, Anthony Gordon, good player, a lot of money to spend on him. Harvey Barnes is like 38 million, something like that. It's a lot of money just to raise your floor now. And obviously then they catch up to that ceiling really quickly of the spending ceiling of FFP. So that's kind of one of the big problems they've got. They can't quite grow the way they need to. They get to do it a lot slower. And so they've had to look for players who are younger, who will get to that level. So that costs a bit of money now, and that's kind of the problem. But that's what City did. They grew steadily with steady improvements, started to raise the ceiling. And when they won the league, it was hard to maintain that. So once they hit that title-winning thing, they dropped off a little bit the next season. They were in the ceiling-raising part. Now, I think you can compare that probably to Newcastle right now, having get to the Champions League is like almost winning a title now, because you can't win against City and Liverpool at the moment. Or maybe someone will this season. But that's the problem, right? So you've hit that ceiling and then you drop off a little bit. So it looks like maybe Eddie Howe's the Mancini manager. He got dinghied the year after and they brought in Pellegrini when results didn't go the way they want. So Eddie Howe might be their long-term planning manager, but if he doesn't hit the targets along their strategic growth, they'll have a big line they want to climb up the hill.
Do you think he'll be given more time because, like you said, it's harder to raise the ceiling now because you get less bang for your buck?
Well, I think because they're in this period of growth where he has assembled the squad, you want to keep him there so that he's fostering it, because they're not meant to win the league yet. This is the thing, they're meant to be growing, and so you keep some consistency. You don't deviate from what you've got. You've got things like Dan Ashworth behind the scene going away, and they might have. Last time I saw, they were linked with the Benfica director, who'd be amazing. Just somebody who brings in like young players, develops them, and has got a good eye for. If he doesn't hit his targets, I think they would quite happily get rid and bring someone else in who brings them to the next level. But they'll be there maybe 3-4 years. I think in 4 years will be the time that they should be Champions League every single season. That's what they'd want. Because in the next part, once you've got to that bit where you're solidified as a Champions League team, that's when you start adding to your house and make it taller. Build a skyscraper. Now, Man City did it by putting the blocks in place really early. I don't know how you build a new floor above your roof. You ever tried that before?
No, but I imagine Dan Ashworth was their architect, and now their architect is on gardening leave.
But then you need the builders as well. I guess you have to plan it first, and then Man City planned it with Begarostein and Soriano, who came in as a Pep Guardiola
acolyte
colleagues. It's like on Grand Designs where you've sort of pre-made these really funky things in a factory somewhere in Finland, and then you ship them over and suddenly they're all there and 2 floors spring up in about 2 weeks.
It's exactly like that. It's exactly the same. I agree. And so that's what they did. And Soriano was on Grand Designs and then brought in Pep Guardiola to make his house lovely and sexy. And then, of course, that's where you've got. Now, the equivalent of what Newcastle might be aiming towards would be like, who would be the equivalent Pep Guardiola now who could take you to another place and establish a playing style? So that's the Newcastle way. Because Newcastle already have their sort of, to me, it's like the Kevin Keegan always attacking way, you know? But like you can't always do that. I mean, there's elements of what Howe does. It's interesting that they concede and score more per game than Keegan's Newcastle ever did. They are the entertainers, 2x or something like that. Anyway, so that's where they are now. And the equivalent might be someone like Xabi Alonso, who you're not going to get right now, but they'll probably be looking for 3-4 years when they can bring that manager in that can take them to the heights and glories of a potential Premier League win when Guardiola and Klopp aren't there anymore.
So to summarise, through the lens of transfers, Newcastle are at step 2 on the Man City buying success O-meter.
I think they should be probably on floor raising, but because they reached Champions League early, they've maybe deviated slightly into ceiling raising, which has made it a complex environment, especially when the ceiling raising player you bring in is then banned for a long time.
They've graduated to step 2 too early. Now Howe has to sort of help manage expectation on that front.
Yeah, they're still
without his
their
marquee
strategy
signing.
they'll still be in part 1, but they've had to change it a little bit. They even talk about it in that documentary on Amazon where they talk about how they've had to change because the injuries come in, but they know they need to have better players for Champions League and they weren't planning for it quite so quickly.
Nice.
I think there is one thing here which is worth mentioning though with Eddie Howe and his floor raising, where almost Atlas-like, his superpower as a coach is improving players on the training field, and that is why they've got better so quickly. If you look at when he came in, the amount of players who he's already improved, whether that's Joelinton, But there's also Fabian Schär. I think Joe Willock's a really good example. Before he was injured this season, he was probably on the edge of the England squad. I mean,
Almiron became amazing all of a sudden.
Anthony Gordon this season is a different player to the one who was seen at Everton. I know he's a new signing, but that's all Eddie Howe's work there. So there's an extent to which his own good work doing that stuff on the training pitch has led to this problem where there's not necessarily the infrastructure in behind to support it. But when we're talking about should Eddie Howe eventually be replaced by a better manager, I think that his work actually improving the existing players outside of tactical systems, outside of transfers, really should be noted.
Very diplomatic of you. I like how you've pivoted from grand designs to Atlas there. The range on this man, he's got it all, John. Buying good players in isolation, not good enough. Obviously have to match that up with a long-term plan on the pitch as well, Jonathan. Something that another Premier League winner in Liverpool did not right away under FSG. It took them a little while to get it correct, didn't it? But then once things married up, they made substantial progression. So looking at
Jonathan, is it?
Yeah. Full named it.
Didn't know that.
Jonathan Mackenzie.
Have you ever been a Jonty?
My dad called me Jonty for a bit. I've been called JJ. When I was young, I was known as JJ. My mates now either call me Macca or Jono.
I will never call you Jonty. That is despicable. Right, enough behind the scenes chat, Jonty. Looking back at Liverpool's return from relative obscurity then to title winners, is there a similar crossroads that Newcastle find themselves at now in terms of evolving tactically to achieve something bigger in the future?
Well, I want to talk about Liverpool, particularly as they developed under Jurgen Klopp, because I think there's lots of similarities between Newcastle now and where Liverpool were at the beginning of Klopp's tenure. Namely because when Jurgen Klopp comes into Liverpool, he wants to build a team in the image of the teams that he's built in the Bundesliga, and what that team is trying to do is control games mainly out of possession. So we know that Jurgen Klopp comes in and talks about the famous quote about gegenpressing being the best number 10, essentially. He's going to come in, build this team where they're going to try and control games out of possession, and that's where they're going to get a lot of their upside. Newcastle, very, very similar. So what I want to do is just show you how similar the Newcastle team of last season were to the Liverpool team early on in Klopp's tenure. Nice. Let's start off with the out of possession stuff. So as we know, teams like Newcastle and Liverpool want to press high up the field. They're going to try and destabilise opposition build-up, and they're going to do it in very similar ways. So we've got Newcastle here against Manchester United last season. This is the home game. Newcastle in a 4-3-3, which is very similar to what Liverpool like to use. And we're going to look at an example from 18-19 season where basically they're set up in exactly the same way. The idea is that Manchester United are going to try and build out the back. That's going to trigger a press from Newcastle. Isak's going to come in here, block the pass back across. Saint-Maximin's going to step up. This leaves the fullback free, so you're almost baiting that pass in. When that comes in, often you'll see teams jump up fullback to fullback, but in this instance, what we see is the Newcastle midfield just shifting around. Willock, the outside midfielder on this side, is going to jump up, put Dalot under pressure. This leaves McTominay free, so Guimaraes is going to have to jump up. Again, this is a little bit strange because often the central midfielder in a 3 will stay deeper and it will be the other midfielder who would go, but we've got Newcastle pushing up Guimaraes in this instance, and everyone follows across. And the idea now is you've got everyone is marked player for player, very hard to build up, very intense pressing, and lots of distances as well, right? So Willock has to move all the way across here.
Yes.
We can talk about how Newcastle have fallen off. That's because the amount of distance they're expected to cover is so big that teams are finding those spaces.
Really narrow from the start, right, as well. They start narrow, so it has to go wide every single time,
Yeah, so Man United, very different insofar as they'll start their wide players much wider in that high press, whereas with Newcastle, they're within the space of the box.
Okay.
And if you go back and watch Newcastle's win over PSG from earlier this season, the first goal where they forced PSG into a mistake is from exactly this setup, forcing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is in unsettled possession with the opposition because the opposition don't have the ball under control properly, which is why Newcastle are going to be happy to jump up. If Manchester United manage to build out and get what we call settled possession, which is when they basically have possession of the ball in their back line and the opposition have dropped off a little bit, what we see then from Newcastle is they do drop off into more of a passive press. So they'll go into something more like a 4-5-1 shape, like this. They'll let the opposition will obviously be pushed up the field. They will let them have the ball, and they're actually quite passive. Most people wouldn't think that presses like this are quite passive, but the idea is that they want to start deep, push the opposition back, and as soon as the ball gets moving backwards towards a goalkeeper, that's when you trigger your really aggressive press. Everyone jumps high again. You try and win the ball back in that instance.
So there was variety to how pressed last season, and it wasn't just all like intensity, which is what people focused on, right?
Yeah, and the same is true of Liverpool, right? A lot of people think of Liverpool's press as being just constantly intense, but as we'll see, similar, they're going to press up high. Well, let's go to the screen now. They're going to press up high in these moments of unsettled possession for the opposition, because the opposition doesn't have control of the ball, so it's much easier to cause them problems. Right. As soon as they get settled possession, they'll be a little bit more passive, and they'll try and force the opposition into playing the ball backwards. That's the trigger to then go aggressive, because as soon as you're playing away from your own goal, it becomes much harder to control it, and those are the triggers that they use to jump forward. So this is an example here of, like I say, Liverpool versus Chelsea in 18-19, and the same things are true, right? We've got the narrow front
the
three.
year 18-19.
Yeah, 18-19, yeah. But,
the old tactics.
Jurgen Klopp's been around for a while, yeah, you might have forgotten it. But
Playing Newton Heath.
Same principles. This is the famous-ish Liverpool team. It's not quite the final iteration of that team, but you've got your front three, very narrow here in this instance. The same thing's going to happen if the ball comes out to Rudiger. Mane's going to push up. Firmino's going to close the pitch on the other side, and then we'll have Milner jumping out to Azpilicueta. Kante jumps in to help out. Henderson follows him. Again, it's unusual that it's not the outside midfielder on the other side who's jumping up. It's actually the central midfielder as well. Wijnaldum will move around, and again, we've got the same situation where everyone's marked on the same. It's literally exactly the same shape. So Eddie Howe's clearly been watching early Jurgen Klopp Liverpool.
Probably been at coaching seminars together or something, and shared it.
Yeah, and he'd spent some time out. He probably decided he wanted to play in this kind of way, and was watching some of these early tapes back.
As well, it's similar situations when like Klopp took over Liverpool and they were kind of mid-table, right? And so, well, they'd finished second under Rodgers and then 8th, and then that's when Klopp came in. So I guess is the starting point. If you're looking at how to build your club tactics, you look at, well, that's what they did, and so that's a really good thing to...
coming in at a similar point. And does that duality have to exist in terms of the aggressive and the passive press, because the aggressive form of it is so knackering?
I think in terms of like dropping off into this more passive press, which is what Liverpool do as well. So I've shown it on the board here, and now we've got Chelsea in settled possession. The reason why Liverpool wouldn't press aggressively here is because it's just not worth the while. It's much easier for teams to play through you here. So all you're going to do is probably leave spaces open. So you're going to pick and choose the moments after you've got settled possession to then jump. Liverpool's slightly different from Newcastle, I'd say, because I think Newcastle, they tend to be a bit flatter in the midfield, so their wide forwards drop right back. And whereas with Liverpool, we'd see a little bit more of a narrowness here with the central midfielders jumping up to make sure that if the ball is passed through to a pivot, they can jump on them. But the principles are the same, and the idea is that, you know, if the ball comes into Kante here, say he's the pivot, they allow that pass on, but Kante probably isn't, you know, he's under a lot of pressure now because there's lots of players around him, probably going to end up playing the ball back, and that's going to be a trigger then to jump into that high pressing moment again. So in terms of the out of possession stuff, this is basically exactly the same as what we're seeing from Klopp's, from Eddie Howe's Newcastle.
But what are they trying to do with the ball, John?
Yeah, so when you're a team like Newcastle or Liverpool under Klopp, one of the ways that you can play in possession is you can be really direct and aggressive because you have the ability to win the ball back if you turn it over. So a lot of teams will in the Premier League will be patient, picking their spot to go forward, because if you go forward too quickly, you can be in danger of losing the ball and the ball's going to come straight back at you. And you don't want to get into these sorts of basketball games where the ball's going forwards and backwards.
Exact offside as well there.
Yeah, you don't want that to happen. But with Newcastle, similar to Liverpool, under early Klopp, they have the ability to be super direct, to go forward really quickly. If they lose the ball, they then have all of these fantastic, like, aggressive players who can then counter press to win it back. So you lose the ball, don't worry, win it back. If you win it back, you then have the opposition in a bit of a chaotic game state, which creates space for you then to be able to attack as well, right? So if you go forward, lose the ball, it doesn't matter because we might actually generate another attacking play as well. So again, similar from what we see from Liverpool, they're the same kind of thing under early Klopp. Get the ball forward quickly. If you lose it, counter press, and you can generate chances yourself.
Controlled aggression. Controlled
aggression, but it does cause problems, right? Because if you're relying on your midfield in particular to win these second balls, if you lose it going direct, you want to have really physically elite midfielders. And often physically elite midfielders come at the expense of creativity in midfield. So Liverpool had this problem early under Klopp. You know, you've got Jordan Henderson, you've got James Milner, players like that playing in your midfield. Where are you going to get your creativity from in the in-possession phase? And the answer that they found to that problem was fullbacks. So they brought in Trent Alexander-Arnold, they had Andy Robertson on the other side, and they used those fullbacks as a way of getting high up the pitch and then creating chances for strikers from forwards. Same things happened for Newcastle. They brought in Trippier very early on, and again, they play very direct, but how many times do you see Trippier in these kind of areas actually fashioning chances? I think
He's
a huge
the
amount.
highest chance creator, I think, over the last 2 seasons.
Yeah.
A lot of it's from set pieces, but like even open play, I think he's one of the highest in the Premier League.
Yeah.
I mean, Newcastle really like attacking on the right-hand side half space through these little triangles with Almiron, Bruno Guimaraes and Trippier. That's kind of where he's really proved his weight in 12 million.
I love the stuff they do in that, because how many times do you see them, particularly in when they've got settled possession again, but these sorts of balls into the half space in the box, where one of them runs in, or Isak can run out, and then they generate these cutbacks from there. I think they're really good at those kind of things. But again, all focuses around fullback. The fullbacks is the creative hub. So what we've got here is 2 teams that are very similar in Liverpool under Klopp very early on, and Newcastle under Eddie Howe. They're teams that are trying to control the game predominantly out of possession. Even when they're attacking, there's an out of possession element there that if they lose the ball, they can win it back and generate chances from that as well.
Okay, so say he's taking great inspiration from that Liverpool side, and that was a winning Liverpool side. What's the shortfall? Where's the deficit in terms of just copying it?
Yeah, so Liverpool and Newcastle both encountered problems relying predominantly on out of possession to control games, but for very different reasons. Now let's focus on Newcastle first, because the problem that we've seen Newcastle develop in the last few months has been their pressing has dropped off. They're less able to control out of possession. And if you're relying on out of possession to control the game and you lose the ability to do that, suddenly you're not controlling the game in any phase of play. So this is a nice viz that John Muller, one of our analysts, has run up for me. This is just showing the intensity of Newcastle's press during Eddie Howe's tenure. And as you can see, this season just been a massive drop off. So you can see last season, huge gains in terms of what they were doing in terms of intensity, high pressing, and now that's dropping off. That's part of the reason why Newcastle are less good this season, because they're unable to control the game in the way that they want to. So this is clearly a massive problem for Newcastle right now, because they want to be controlling games in this way.
And Newcastle fans will be screaming at us that is down to injury. First and foremost, right, Jacob?
Yeah, let's run through it at almost every phase of a team. If you start in midfield, which is probably not a particularly logical place to start, but here we are.
You start in the middle, I like it.
Exactly. We'll fan out, like sort of Dan Ashworth does with his spokes influence. Newcastle have, for long periods, lacked Joelinton and Joe Willock. I think they're really important because they're both Newcastle's most athletic midfielders. John was talking about that earlier, but they're also really technical, especially Joe Willock, although Joelinton last season, his success rate with passing while under pressure was actually one of the very best in the league, which is a side of him which hasn't necessarily been explored that well before. So they've effectively been left with a midfield three of Bruno Guimaraes, of Lewis Miley, who is technically very good, but he's 17 and doesn't have the physical side yet, and Sean Longstaff, who, while he's physically very good, technical play has never been one of his greatest strengths. Tonali should have been that player as well, who was brought in to marry some technical ability and this massive motor, and because of gambling in Italy, he's not been at Newcastle's disposal. In the front three, there's been more injuries. You've got Anthony Gordon, who's an absolute pressing machine, but he has been asked to play every single game on the left. One of Alexander Isak or Callum Wilson is always injured. They're rotating, and you've basically got Miguel Almiron on the right, similar story to Gordon. The other thing which has been really important this season is the loss of Nick Pope. So Nick Pope's, his superpower, he's a good shot stopper, but his superpower is his ability as a sweeper keeper to choose when to come out of defence. And Newcastle are a big team defensively, not necessarily the quickest. So they've got Dan Burn, they've got Fabian Schär, who aren't super speedy, and they've got Sven Botman, who's been dealing with a knee injury for most of the season and so isn't as quick as normal. That means that teams have basically, with Pope out, been able to play it over the top of Newcastle. Dubravka can't react to come out and sweep it away, so Newcastle, as a result, have had to drop their defence slightly deeper. They go into the passive stage even earlier, and it opens up more space for an already depleted and tired midfield to have to cover, and that is why the intensity has dropped.
He's got more minutes now as well, because they add on all the injury time. I wonder if that's relevant. Last season they had the ball in play like the least amount of any team. They're putting it out for throw-ins and they recover, so they can do those intense sprints now and again by giving themselves a little bit of time, quite sneaky, and then got found out, and then people started making noise about it. But I wonder if the extra 8 or 9 minutes at the end of games might be relevant when you're already knackered.
Yeah, and we need to talk about Champions League as well, because it changes the tempo of your training schedule as well. So last season, Newcastle will have spent most of their time working on a 2-game week cycle,
Yeah.
so Saturday to Saturday. But with Champions League, you then add a Tuesday or Wednesday game in there. As soon as you're doing that, then obviously you're playing an extra game, but you also have much less time to do some of the training as well.
Yeah.
And the thing which really speaks to that is Newcastle's record after international breaks. So under Eddie Howe over the last 2 seasons, I think there's been 8 or 9 games. They've won all of them but one. The other one was a draw, and their goal difference in those games are roughly 25 goals to 2.
Is that right?
So as soon as they've had a break, they're on it.
Yeah.
As soon as you get into the meat of it, they're starting to run into issues with the injuries.
But just to quickly bring this back to the board, John, have you seen evidence that Eddie Howe is the man who can bring on Newcastle's style of play, evolve it? Has he shown you anything to suggest he's got that versatility?
Well, let's go back to the Liverpool example, because Liverpool, I think, faced a very different problem from relying on out-of-possession play in their evolution under Jurgen Klopp. They didn't necessarily have that moment where they just dropped off because they weren't able to play intensely anymore. But what they did find is that even just focusing on the out-of-possession as their form of controlling games wasn't going to be enough for them to really challenge at the very top, which is, I think, a problem that Newcastle would have hit into even if they didn't drop off on the intensity side of things as well. And the way that Jurgen Klopp solved that was not necessarily by compromising on the out-of-possession intensity, but by finding ways of maybe tempering it by being able to control games in possession a little bit more. So we looked at this game, Chelsea versus Liverpool in 2018-19, and you can see here we've got almost the backbone of their defence that would go on to win Champions Leagues and titles, etc. The season before, so this is what we start seeing from Liverpool from 17-18 to 18-19 is the ability to actually to pick and choose their moments. We talked before about when you're a team who controls game out of possession, you can play direct football and win the ball back quickly with your counter press. But you're relying on your counter press there. If your counter press is off, suddenly you end up in these games where you lose control very quickly. So what Liverpool started doing was developing ways of controlling the ball in possession, deciding the moments when they were going to play the ball forward, and being able to actually eventually squeeze oppositions deeper and deeper with ball possession, not having to get the ball quickly forward as much as possible, but actually picking and choosing those moments. And the big changes that we see here, again, comes back to what we were talking about with JJ, is that they started raising the floor, raising the ceiling. So this season they've got Van Dijk and Alisson in the team. The season before they had Mignolet and they were playing Klavan and Lovren as their defenders like this. They were much less able to play that controlled way because these two on the ball, much less accomplished than Van Dijk and Joe Gomez and of Joel Matip, who was the other defender in that
Klavan
season.
being compared to Van Dijk.
Yeah. Which it's an obvious point, but what improving the quality of players in their back line allowed them to do was to be able to possess the ball at the back, to then be able to control the game in possession rather than just having to rely on the out possession. If the out possession didn't work, you're sort of up the creek. And so, this is the big question that we're going to now throw towards Eddie Howe. And the question is, can he start developing ways of controlling games in possession as well as out of possession? And I think the way that Liverpool did it was, yes, by bringing in better players. So Eddie Howe will have the same sort of mitigating factor there, and you could argue, with better players he might be able to develop these sorts of ideas. But the big question is, can he evolve? Because Jurgen Klopp, I think, did evolve. He recognised that he couldn't play the way that he wanted to play at the beginning. Later on, if he wanted to challenge for titles or challenge for Champions Leagues, and so he slightly modified his way of playing. Can Eddie Howe do that? And I think this is going to be the question that Newcastle's owners have to ask. Is he the guy to move them on tactically? Give him a few seasons, see if he can do it. If not, then they'll bring someone else in, no doubt, to be able to start adding those in possession control elements.
There's also the thing where other managers and analysts will work out what the other team is doing, and you can then suss that out. And I think like lots of teams, when Liverpool had the momentum and the energy and the intensity, it was very hard to stop them, even though you knew exactly what they were doing. But when Newcastle started having the loss of momentum with energy and intensity going with injuries, and lack of coordination even in the pressing, when you start having different players on there, then suddenly you become more vulnerable and you can't do the things you're doing before, so you've got to evolve anyway. And that's probably an issue that we'll have to come up with.
I think there's a really interesting split between Eddie Howe at Bournemouth and Eddie Howe at Newcastle. At Bournemouth, he was constantly changing system, changing formation, and I think pretty much every year it was changing. Whereas Newcastle, they've been wedded to this 4-3-3 for pretty much the last 2 seasons. I think until they played 5 at the back a couple of weeks ago, they'd started 4 at the back and 4-3-3 for 130 successive games. It is very single-minded in his ideology. So it's effectively, has his past been a way of tinkering for him to reach this kind of mimetic ideal of football, which he's now always going to stick with? Or is this just the best thing to have right now and he's going to move it on as he starts to progress Newcastle's system?
I'm glad you mentioned the present, because both of your parts I feel like brings us to the same point, this convergence here, in that like what do Newcastle do next, and what they do next is going to be hampered by off the pitch matters, right? We discussed PSR very briefly. I just wanted to ask you, Jacob, how central qualifying for the Champions League, or just European football full stop at this point, is to their transformation into like title contenders? And will they have to sell anyone this summer to combat those issues and move forward in the long term, take that short term hit?
Yeah, there's multiple factors to it. I think the most simple one to deal with is just purely attracting players. It effectively gives you a leg up in the transfer market if you can offer this to ambitious, talented young players. But the other side is from the PSR side, the revenue side. Under Mike Ashley, Newcastle were basically a way to get cheap advertising. The sort of commercial deals which they had were sort of massively undervalued for what they should be. So this is a club who now has to grow their revenue more quickly. The Champions League is a massive part of that, not just in the prize money sense, but from the TV revenue, from the sort of calibre of deals you can sign. I think it's no surprise that the Adidas deal was announced around the same time as their first Champions League match. If you don't have that and you take that half step back, you start to worry about if other teams' brands are going to start to overtake you. You have Aston Villa potentially coming up the tracks. You have Tottenham entrenching themselves as quite a long way ahead of Newcastle, whereas I think Newcastle realistically for the next couple of seasons would like to almost see Spurs as a model of the sort of financial world in which they could inhabit. Those are the challenges they're going to have to start to deal with, and why, in a way, they've got an outside chance of reaching the Conference League this season. I do think that's important, to have some form of European football for them. If not for a footballing side, they might still be exhausted, but just purely from the commercial side.
It's interesting that JJ highlighted that qualifying for the Champions League ahead of time also exposes some chinks in their transfer armour, because what you're saying here is that it also exposes some of their infrastructure problems too, and sort of their ability to generate revenue and keep acting like a big club, which also brings us to the fact they're playing in Australia 3 days after the Premier League season finishes, and all their players are going to be shattered.
Quite. So I sort of raised this with a senior figure at the club, saying, you've been dealing with all of these injuries, everyone's exhausted, why are you travelling across the world for 2 games? And they were making the point that it's something they need to do commercially, but also it's a symbol of where they are as a club. They were, I think they used the word honoured to be part of it, because the alternative was, if Newcastle had gone through in the FA Cup and Chelsea had gone out to Leicester, Chelsea would have been the club who were playing Tottenham in Melbourne. And it kind of speaks that Newcastle see themselves as now being in that company. They see themselves as big clubs do post-season tours, and in a way their belief is that they have the player care systems in place to mean that flying halfway around the world, potentially 2 weeks before the Euros and Copa America, is absolutely fine. Disagree on that. But that is the reasoning behind that. They see it as pretty much a necessity rather than a luxury at this point.
There's Darren Eales, who talks a lot about, well, in the documentary, he talks a lot about, because he grew Atlanta United in America from nothing, literally nothing. He was the first employee to being what they are now. And he sees his job at Newcastle as being very similar, in that he's trying to basically build a club from the very bottom up. And one of the huge things is trying to make them a worldwide fan base, not just a team localised in Newcastle. It's meant to be all around the entire world. So he was going out to America to try and get supporters groups in Philadelphia and things like that, try and get that going.
But I like how this example, them having to act like a big club, also inconveniences them. I feel like that's quite emblematic for where they currently find themselves at.
It's very dress for the job you want.
Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to ask some final questions. JJ, just to bring us back to transfers. Like, why will it take longer for them to build a squad a title-winning squad than it did for the likes of City and Chelsea then? Just like snapshot overview points, just at the times we find ourselves in and the position like City are in, for example.
It's the times. It's the times that we're in. We know why. They've got FFP regulation things, so they can't spend that much money. They've got to sell players they've already got probably to fund any new ones that they want to. Players are really expensive now. Recruitment around the world is really good, so anyone who's young and behind the potential development is already, well, they go to Benfica basically, and then you just can't get them, you can't bring them in, can't afford it. So even like a cheap squad player, like the equivalent of, not Gareth Barry because he was good, who's an equivalent of like a squad player? Like, I mean, Harvey Barnes is a good example of a player who's good, a bit of potential, can make your floor higher, but he cost you £38 million rather than being 15 that maybe they should be.
It's worth saying, like, according to the PSR rules, you can make £105 million of losses over 3 seasons. That's 35 million a year of losses. 38 million for Harvey Barnes is more than the losses you can make, right? So you're going to have to recoup that in revenue in order to be able to even buy anyone else. So that's how, what's happened is that player value is inflated, but the PSR regulations haven't inflated either. And so we're getting to this point now where you're just unable to buy as many players as maybe you were in the past.
Unless they could find a way, of course, if there was some sort of money-fueled league that would be able to afford to buy someone like Jacob Murphy for £89 million and it was ratified by everyone else thinking that is fair valuation.
Nice.
That's the thing. They can't really do that because no one will let them have the fair valuation of it. It becomes problematic. So.
But the other FFP hack is to effectively sign a player for 10 million and make him into a £40 million player, which is something which Eddie Howe has shown he does have a potential to do with players in the squad. That is the flip side.
And to bring it back to a tactical perspective as well, John, is the Premier League just so much more developed than it was when Chelsea and Man City, expedited their rise, that it's just going to take Newcastle so much longer to cultivate that winning identity now?
Yeah, in prepping for this, I watched a lot of games from the mid-2010s just to see what was going on. And I watched a few games between Liverpool and Man City, and it's 10 years since that, and the quality of football since then has gone up. You wouldn't necessarily think it, but it's incredible how tactically developed the league has become. I think COVID had a role to play in that because I think there was a lot of space and time for people at clubs to think about what they were doing from a tactical point of view. And so what we're getting to now is, the teams at the very top are just so tactically advanced. Like Arsenal this season, just the very cutting edge of where football tactics is at. Man City have been at that level for ever since Pep Guardiola came in. Jurgen Klopp has been incredible that he's come in and, as we've said, been able to evolve tactically. So the problem with teams trying to come through now, both in terms of like the infrastructure and finances, but also in terms of the tactical side of things, and that includes things like having coaches who are able to coach high level. For example, pressing that we've talked about here, like pressing has come on incredibly far in the last 5 years. That just doesn't happen overnight. Arsenal are good at pressing now because they were, they started putting things in place 5 years ago that allow them to be where they're at now. And that's the problem with any club trying to come through. They're just at the back of the race to get good. And I think the thing that I've learned, I think, from the last few weeks, because we talked about Manchester United last week, the teams who succeeded, the teams who are ruthless, and they're constantly churning squads, they're constantly churning staff, and they're always thinking they're not happy to accept just plateauing at any level. I think that's what we're going to see from both Newcastle and Manchester United. Do they stick with their managers, or do they take the brave decision? No, we think there's a coach out there who can raise us to the next level. Do we move the manager on and bring that manager in to actually raise our level? And those are the clubs that have done that. And what we've seen from Manchester City, I think, is that at every level, it's like, what's the next level? What's the next level? We're never happy to just rest on our laurels.
Capitalism.
Well, you've all given really nice, nuanced answers, so I'm going to ask you to be really reductive at the end of the episode here. Can you win a league title coming from mid-table or the lower end of the Premier League with all that cash in 10 years now, or is that just impossible?
I think it's possible. I think Arsenal could do it, right? Arsenal have made that transition really in the last 5 years. So I definitely think it is possible. But I think in terms of actually doing it, you have to get everything right at every moment, and everything has to fall into place, and you have to have the sort of revenue that a club like Arsenal have. So yeah, possible, very difficult.
Let's make it more specifically Newcastle then.
I think Newcastle have the ability to, because they know they will be back through the transfer market. It's important that they grow their revenue before the PSR rules change in a couple of years' time to being a squad cost ratio, which could perhaps be even more restrictive on the amount that the non-elite clubs are able to spend. We'll get into that down the line.
Part 2.
They may be able to profit from some fortunate timing. I mean, Jurgen Klopp is already leaving Liverpool at the end of the season. Pep Guardiola's contract expires at the end of next year. We don't know if he's going to sign another one. There may be a natural kind of shifting of the order which they are able to exploit, but that means that next season has to be a massively transformational one for them.
Okay, nice. JJ?
Yes.
Lovely. There we have it. 2 no's, 1 yes, but roughly a decade.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and Rafa Honigstein. With the latest transfer news and insight on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football and you can try it free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.